In the shadowed hierarchies of outlaw motorcycle clubs, loyalty is not just a virtue, it is the currency of survival. But when that currency is devalued by betrayal, the resulting debt is often collected in pain. In June 2022, a grim chapter in New Zealand's gang history was written, not on the open road, but within the claustrophobic walls of a property in Wimana. It was here that a misguided attempt at internal discipline spiraled into a tragedy that would ultimately send 4 men to prison and leave a family grieving the loss of a father. The victim was Mark Ho Huwa, known within the ranks as the Shark, a patched member of the Tribesmen MC. His fate was sealed not by a rival gang, but by the very brotherhood he had sworn to protect. The catalyst for this unfortunate event was surprisingly mundane, yet it struck at the heart of the club's rigid code of conduct. Evidence presented in the High Court at Hamilton revealed that the friction began with a financial discrepancy. The club's president, Conway Rapana, had uncovered a series of unauthorized online transactions made using the club's account. To the outside world, this might seem like a simple administrative error or a petty theft. However, within the high-stakes environment of the tribesmen, this was interpreted as a severe breach of trust. For Rapana, it was more than just missing funds. It was a direct challenge to his authority, and a sign of disrespect that could not go unanswered. Consumed by the need to reassert control, Rapana did not seek mediation or a verbal reprimand. Instead, he reached out to his inner circle surgeon at arms tape at Tukino Bid, and Vice President Jeremiah Gadgetto determined the appropriate course of action. The leadership decided to invoke a fearsome and archaic method of punishment, known in the underworld as a hotbox. This term describes a coordinated physical intervention, typically carried out by multiple members against one of their own. The objective of a hotbox is rarely to end a life. Rather, it is designed to humiliate the target, break their spirit, and physically reinforce the absolute demand for obedience. It is a tool of fear, meant to strip a member of their ego, and remind the entire group of the consequences of crossing leadership. In this instance, the court later heard that the president's directive was clear. Mark was to be made an example of. The intention was to deliver a physical message that would resonate through the ranks, ensuring that no other member would dare to misuse club resources or defy the president's will. However, what was planned as a controlled exercise in dominance soon escalated beyond anyone's control. Witnesses would later describe how the atmosphere at the property shifted from disciplinary to chaotic, setting the stage for a severe incident that the court would describe as a wrong-headed act of discipline. As the plans were laid and the order was given, the machinery of the club turned against Mark, setting in motion a sequence of events that would transform a disciplinary meeting into a fatal tragedy. 2 days later, on June 18, 2022, the abstract concept of discipline transformed into a tangible and terrifying reality. Sergeant at arms tape at Tukino Bid arrived at a residence in Wakatani, tasked with collecting Mark for the mandatory meeting. The atmosphere was already thick with unspoken dread. Mark was not alone. His teenage son Matthew Jr. was present, a silent observer to his father's unraveling state. The court later heard testimony suggesting that Mark was deeply apprehensive, having consumed alcohol likely in an attempt to steel his nerves against the impending confrontation. He understood the code he lived by, and he knew that a summons of this nature was rarely a social call. Bid, adhering to his role as the enforcer, made it clear that attendance was not optional. The journey to the gang property on Harsh Road in Wimana was, in retrospect, a one-way trip into the heart of a storm. Upon their arrival, the setting resembled a dark tribunal more than a clubhouse gathering. President Conway Rapana wasted little time with pleasantries. In the presence of other members, he directly challenged the victim regarding the unauthorized financial activity. The air in the room was charged with tension, waiting for a satisfactory explanation that never came. When Mark failed to provide an answer that could appease the leadership, the fragile peace shattered. Rapana signaled for the hotbox procedure to commence, and the dynamic in the room shifted instantly from interrogation to physical intervention. Bid, acting on the hierarchy's command, initiated the altercation. What followed was described by witnesses as a chaotic and intense scene. The physical chastisement was not limited to a single individual. As is the nature of the hotbox, others joined the fray, delivering a barrage of strikes intended to overwhelm and subdue. The intensity of the situation was such that the teenage boy who had accompanied his father had to be swiftly removed from the immediate vicinity. This act of shielding the youth highlights a jarring contradiction within the gang's ethos, protecting the innocence of the next generation, while simultaneously inflicting severe harm upon their own elder. As the physical confrontation continued, the situation grew increasingly desperate. There was a fleeting moment where Mark managed to stagger away, a desperate attempt to distance himself from the aggression. However, the reprieve was short-lived. He was intercepted and dragged back into the center of the conflict. The escalation did not stop at the property line. In a move that signaled the total loss of control over the situation, the attackers forced Mark into the boot of a Toyota. He was then transported away from the compound to a nearby riverbank. This relocation served to isolate him further, stripping away any hope of external intervention. Left by the water's edge for a time, battered and disoriented, he was eventually retrieved and brought back to the property. By this stage, the line between disciplinary ritual and a life-threatening event had been irrevocably crossed. By the time Mark was returned to the main property, the atmosphere had shifted from one of enforced discipline to palpable panic. He was barely conscious, his condition rapidly deteriorating before the eyes of those who had sought to correct him. The leadership, specifically President Conway Rapana, was forced to confront a reality they had not anticipated. The line had been crossed, and the situation was now critical. Recognizing the severity of Mark's state, Rapana issued a new directive. Members were ordered to transport the victim to Wakatani Hospital immediately. However, this act of mercy was shrouded in deception. Instructions were given to fabricate a story about how the injuries had occurred, a desperate attempt to shield the club from the inevitable scrutiny of law enforcement. When the vehicle arrived at the hospital, around 11:00 a.m., the gravity of the situation was undeniable. Mark was unresponsive. Medical staff, trained to look past cover stories, quickly assessed that the trauma was consistent with a severe and sustained physical altercation. The injuries were far too extensive to be explained away by accidental means. Recognizing that his life hung in the balance, doctors arranged for an emergency airlift to Waikato Hospital, a facility better equipped for critical trauma care. Despite their best efforts and emergency surgical intervention, the damage proved irreversible. On June 19, 2022, Mark Ho Huwa succumbed to his injuries, his life cut short by the very brotherhood he had pledged to serve. The subsequent forensic examination painted a harrowing picture of his final hours. Pathologists discovered that Mark had sustained at least 8 distinct impacts to his head and body. These were consistent with being struck by hard objects or subjected to intense physical force. The medical evidence presented to the court pinpointed the cause of the tragedy. While he had suffered multiple injuries, one powerful catastrophic impact to the head had been the decisive factor. This specific injury, combined with the cumulative trauma of the event, had led to a fatal outcome that could not be undone. The legal reckoning that followed was extensive. During the High Court trial in Hamilton, the jury was tasked with untangling the web of responsibility. Justice David Johnston presided over weeks of intense testimony, ultimately guiding the jury to a nuanced verdict. The court found that while President Rapana may not have delivered the final blow himself, he was the architect of the event. His authority had sanctioned the Hotbox, and his decision-making was the primary cause of the tragedy. Consequently, both Rapana and Sergeant-at-Arms Bid, who was found to have played an active, physical role in the enforcement, were found guilty of the most serious charge related to the intentional loss of life. The judgment did not end there. Vice President Jeremiah Gage, who had facilitated the meeting and encouraged the disciplinary action, along with Associate Tape Tapera, who participated in the physical confrontation and the hospital transport, were convicted of the lesser but still grave charge of culpable liability for the fatality. Interestingly, a fifth individual, Dean Collier, a prospect of the club accused of participating, was acquitted. The jury found him not guilty of both the primary and alternative charges, and he was discharged from custody. A reminder that in the eyes of the law, presence does not always equate to guilt. The verdicts sent a shockwave through the gang community, establishing that the code of silence could effectively be dismantled by forensic truth. In the solemn hush of the High Court, the final act of this tragedy played out, not with physical force, but with the weight of judicial condemnation. Justice David Johnston, presiding over the sentencing, delivered a searing indictment that resonated far beyond the four walls of the courtroom. He dismantled the defense of brotherhood and discipline, exposing the so-called Hotbox ritual for what it truly was: an unnecessary and dangerous instrument of fear. In his address, the justice remarked that such practices serve no constructive purpose. They merely entrench a culture where intimidation masquerades as respect. He challenged the defendants to see that their actions had not strengthened their club, but rather had stripped a man of his future and left a void in a family that no apology could fill. The judge emphasized that true honor does not require the destruction of one's peers, and that the code they followed was built on a foundation of toxicity that ultimately consumes its own. The sentences handed down reflected the severity of the loss. Conway Rapana and Tape at Tukinobid, identified as the primary architects of the fatal event, received life sentences. Rapana, as the leader who authorized the directive, was ordered to serve a minimum of 13 years before becoming eligible for parole. Bid, the enforcer of that directive, received a minimum term of 12 years. The court recognized the secondary roles of the others involved. Jeremiah Gage was sentenced to 5 years, with the judge noting his efforts toward rehabilitation and literacy while in custody. Tape Tapera received a sentence of 4 years and 6 months, a duration mitigated by his youth, lack of prior convictions and compliance while on electronically monitored bail. These judgments served as a stark reminder that in the eyes of the law, group loyalty is no shield against individual accountability. To fully understand the gravity of this case, one must look at the broader canvas of the Tribesmen Motorcycle Club's history. Established in 1980 in the Bay of Plenty town of Murupara, the club has long been a dominant force, recognized by their yellow colors and distinctive salute. However, their internal stability has often been tested by external wars. The backdrop to Mark's tragedy involves a long-standing and bitter rivalry with the Killer Bees, a group that was originally formed in 2003 as a feeder organization for the Tribesmen. In a twist of irony, the Killer Bees were founded by Josh Masters, who was once a vice president of the Tribesmen. What began as a mentorship turned into a fracture, culminating in the 2019 targeted attack on Masters himself. That incident ignited a series of intense confrontations across Auckland, drawing intense police scrutiny, and forcing both groups to tighten their internal security paranoia that likely contributed to the harsh internal discipline that cost Mark his life. Mark's story serves as a grim monument to the dangers of this lifestyle. It exposes the reality that in the world of organized motorcycle clubs, the greatest threat often comes not from rival factions or law enforcement, but from within the circle of trust itself. The judge's closing remarks linger as a warning. When loyalty is twisted into fear, and discipline becomes a fatal act, the only outcome is grief. This case remains a definitive example of how codes of honor can become traps of destruction, leaving behind nothing but memories and lengthy prison terms.